Welcome back, goobers. Today, we'll be talking about some very early systems of notation to create some context for what the later systems of notation we'll be discussing emerged out of. We won't go into all or even any of these very deeply, but they provide valuable insight about historical trends and the sociocultural perspectives on music throughout history nonetheless. I would like to take some time here to state unequivocally that the modern notation system does not necessarily have a common genealogical or causal relationship with past systems, nor do those older systems necessarily share that connective tissue with each other. Different streams of systems emerged to offer distinct solutions to the same fundamental problems posed by attempting to capture music and writing, and they often did so in parallel. This is called convergent evolution. If you've heard people on PBS yapping about why everything is turning into crabs, this is what they're talking about. It's a real thing, and it's really interesting, so you should look it up, but not now. Anyways, systems vary drastically from one another, depending on the time and depending on the place, and a scholar can never be certain that a commonality between two systems is evidence that one system influenced the other, or if the two systems simply underwent convergent evolution. It's just a little forewarning preamble. But before we get started for real, please remember to like and subscribe, and leave any questions in the comments, and make sure you hit the bell icon to get notified when I post a new video. I'm looking to grow the channel and would really appreciate your help. And without further ado, let's dive in. So the two fundamental questions here are, 1, which aspects of music require setting down in order for the music to be performable with only the notation to go off of? And 2, how might one go about creating a single written system that captures all of those aspects? No matter how you answer, there's going to be a million more essential questions, but let's take this one step at a time. There are countless aspects to the music we listen to. Yes, pitch, rhythm, harmony, articulation, dynamic, speed, and so forth. But also aspects that even conventional modern notation is poorly equipped to capture, such as location, acoustics, audience behaviors as partakers in the musical experience, embodiment, and so much more. Which aspects are quote-unquote fundamental and which are quote-unquote gravy is obviously subjective, and whether or not a system of notation effectively captures an aspect of music and writing is more of a spectrum than a binary. With that said, we can start to look at how early systems went about solving this dilemma and hopefully learn a little bit about the biases and subtexts of this tradition that are born out of these solutions. So the first system we're talking about today dates back to the 9th century in Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire. It's often taught as the first ever notation system and the ancestor of all notations to come. And while I object to the idea that it sprung up in a vacuum without influence, or that all notational practices date back to it, or that it's even a fraction as seminal to subsequent traditions as it's commonly made out to be, and that's a whole other can of worms, I can agree that it contains many elements that reappear and are developed upon in later models. And even if these elements are not exclusive to the Carolingian system, for these reasons alone, I think it's a useful place to start, if not an arbitrary one. Essentially, Charlemagne required a means of political control for uniting the disparate and rich chanting traditions that were endemic to each town, which had grown apart from each other over the centuries. Charlemagne figured that notation would limit deviation caused by time and distance because everybody would have the same template to guide them. After all, generally speaking, oral traditions are more variable and dynamic than written ones. This Carolingian system is called chironomic neumes, and it shows us a lot about what Charlemagne's theorists and scribes thought was essential to the music. So before we get into the notation itself, let's break down the components of the name, while keeping in mind that they almost certainly did not call their notation chironomic neumes. Chironomy is when conducting, particularly through hand gestures, directs musical performance. Neumes are music notation symbols used to indicate the melodic contour of vocal chants. They are semantic representations of pitches across many systems of notation and have flexible definitions that change with time and place. Ultimately, just know that the word that comes right before the word neumes in the blank neumes construction is really doing most of the heavy lifting for the definition. So with that in mind, going back to chironomy, what does that definition have to do with ink and paper? There are two competing answers. The first is that the shapes refer to hand gestures, which themselves served as mnemonic devices for monks to remember chant melodies, hence chironomy. The other answer, at first blush, has nothing to do with chironomy, but it's a hill some scholars are willing to die on, and I personally think it's really cool. The Byzantines, then a cultural and political powerhouse, had already been using a system of notation by the time Charlemagne came to power called ekphonetic notation, which remains extant to this day. You don't need to worry about it. In a pithy phrase, it's just a guide to the pitched recitation of Holy Scripture. Similar systems existed and exist for Jews chanting Torah in Hebrew or Aramaic, and also for Muslims chanting passages from the Quran in Arabic. This theory goes that Charlemagne borrowed some of these Byzantine symbols and expanded on them and modified them to create a system of neumes that could capture what he wanted to hear. It's worth noting that the word neume is derived from the Greek pneuma, meaning gesture, as in chironomic gestures, so chironomic neumes is just another way of saying chironomic chironomy, which is strong evidence for the Byzantine theory. Personally, I think both can be true to an extent, especially considering that they do overlap, but the jury's still out on this one, and that's not ever going to change. Keep your eyes peeled for an interview I'll be doing later on with a Greek Orthodox priest who specializes in Byzantine chant later in this series. Regarding the notation itself, as you can see, these neumes were basically free-floating contours and dots above the text. With very limited precision, they told you how many notes went to each syllable and whether each note was ascending or descending or stayed the same as the previous note, without specifying the pitch or the interval. The aspects of the music which are maximally detailed, which is really just another way of saying fixed or stable or inflexible, are the ones that we can reasonably assume were considered to be more fundamental to the system, and the aspects which are either incompletely captured or more likely completely ignored can reasonably be said to have been considered as gravy to the Carolingians. Two things are quite concrete: the text and the assigning of sounds to syllables. The exact number of pitches to each syllable is slightly less concrete. The pitches themselves are even less certain, since you know whether you're going up or down, but you don't know where to or where from or the distance between point A and point B. Rhythm is almost entirely ignored, and anything else is left off completely or condemned to the realm of performance practice. Note well that ultimately performance practices are the last holdouts of oral traditions in a written system. Returning to chironomic neumes, though, we can see what people will be building off of going forward when trying to create more elaborate, comprehensive, precise, and practical models, i.e., we can see the fundamental values of notation as we know it. In the 10th and 11th centuries, a system was developed that borrowed the neumes derived from the chironomic system combined with staff-like elements, which I personally believe came from this other really cool unrelated system called Daisian notation, but that's non-falsifiable, so don't go around quoting me on that. Anyhow, out of the Abbey of St. Martial in Aquitaine came Aquitanian notation, where the neumes are set measured distances away from a bold line, sometimes with the aid of a labeled staff, sometimes with the aid of an unlabeled staff, more often without any staff. If there are two voices, the second is set below the bold line. It's best seen in all of its forms in the Codex Calixtinus, where, interestingly enough, the little opening ditty of this video comes from. Getting back on topic, essentially, the innovation is that the intervallic and pitch content can be notated with precision without a substantial increase in complexity. However, it still had no way to notate rhythms. What this notation resulted in was either for the text to be treated syllabically, i.e. every syllable having its own note, or melisematically, which means many pitches to a single syllable. And to accommodate these two different treatments, essentially two systems of writing were born: notatio cum littera, or the notation of single signs for syllabic treatment, and notatio sine littera, or notation of group signs, which represent multiple tones for melisematic treatment. Those are also known as ligatures, which is a word you'll be hearing a lot, and there's much more about them to come. Of course, these two systems were used together all the time because music generally included both syllabic and melisematic treatments of the text within any given work. Similar practices were emerging in Paris centered around the Notre Dame Cathedral, though whether that be because of Aquitanian influence or because of convergent evolution, it's not possible to know. These practices proliferated throughout Western Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries, and that's called the Notre Dame School of Organum. Organum means note against note polyphony. This school and its preeminent members are seminal to the tradition as it develops from here on out. According to the German-American musicologist Willi Apel, in the days of Aquitanian notation, long chains of notes would be sung in the upper voice, or duplum as it was called, over a slow-moving plain chant stock text setting in the tenor, which we also call a cantus firmus, which would be lined up via the singer's improvisatory sympathetic vibes, as heard in the following recording of Leonin's Wiederund Omnes for the Mass for Christmas Day. Over time, however, this system was acknowledged as insufficiently dependable, especially since a handful of patterns were emerging which were considered the standard performance practice. Anyways, along with these gradual changes, shifts in notation were also occurring. The staff was increasingly less optional, and the neumes began to emphasize square note heads, and how note heads were grouped together began to be codified. Essentially, the lexicon of symbols was beginning to become standard and precise. This transition is encapsulated by the term square notation, which for the sake of our narrative we can pedagogically think of as the successor to Aquitanian notation, although it's not as if there's a father-son relationship there. The grammar that evolved to organize these characters into predictable structures that didn't require sympathetic vibes to align was called modal notation, and it's best exemplified here in this piece by one of Lannon's students, Peroton. Modal notation was an early way of understanding rhythm and an early progenitor to meter as we know it today, very early. It was in some ways too complex and inscrutable, and in other ways too simple and limiting, which is worth noting because it indicates to us that the theoreticians of then probably didn't properly conform to the rules as they were theorizing, or at least not 100% of the time. There's too much to sufficiently cover in detail, so I'll just go over the basics as far as they pertain to the systems that come later. In a nutshell, here's how modal notation worked. A note could either be long or short. If it was long, it was called the longa, or L for short, and if it was short, it was called the brevis or breve, or B for short. 6 stereotyped patterns of combinations of the L and the B existed, and these were called the rhythmic modes. One mode would apply to a part for the entirety of a piece, and every group of notes would fall into one of these 6 patterns of rhythms. These modes were each given Greek names centuries after they had gone out of style, but these names can still be useful even if they are anachronistic. The modes are as follows. Trochaic, which is longa brevis, and is the oldest and most common. Iambic, brevis longa, and the accent must fall on the brevis to differentiate it from the trochaic mode. Dactylic, which is longa brevis brevis. Anapestic, which is brevis brevis longa, and that one's kind of rare. Then there is Molossic, which is longa longa. In France they call it spondé. And finally we have Tribrachic, which is brevis brevis brevis. If we, strictly for pedagogical reasons, commit an anachronistic sin and equate the brevis to an eighth note and the longa to a quarter, issues arise when trying to pair certain modes in one voice with certain other modes in other voices. For example, if the duplum is singing in trochaic and the tenor is singing in dactylic, the modes won't regularly line up because for every repetition of the mode in the tenor, the duplum has made 1 1/3 repetitions. And because the total value of one repetition of the trochaic mode is 3/8 notes, and the total value of one repetition of the dactylic mode is 4/8 notes, because of this discrepancy, the two modes will only line up once every 4 repetitions in the duplum and 3 repetitions in the tenor, which is too irregular for the music to be easily followed. Essentially, the problem was that in modern terms, the duplum is in triple and the tenor is in duple. This was resolved by adding 1/8 note to the value of the longa and a second brevis in trochaic mode when combining it with a mode which is in duple. This way it lines up every 2 measures instead of every 4, because the total value of each dactylic repetition has increased from 4 to 6 brevis. Willi Apel encourages us to think of this as compound meter, which I have issues with, but issues aside, his argument is in favor of the sake of simplicity that all modal notation should be read as if it were in 6/8 time, unless it is dactylic or anapestic occurring in isolation. Ultimately, this conundrum is the root of 3 of the most crucial concepts in this series that must be understood for anything else to make sense. Perfection, imperfection, and alteration. Frustratingly, what these words mean do change over the decades and centuries. But for now, think of it this way. Perfect means derived from or constituted of 3 smaller parts, and imperfect means derived from or constituted of 2 smaller parts. Alteration is the process of lengthening the constituent parts of something imperfect so that it cooperates with that which is perfect. Perfect and imperfect can also be used as verbs. To perfect something means to change it so that it is constituted of 3 smaller parts instead of 2. And conversely, to imperfect something is to change it so that it is constituted of 2 smaller parts instead of 3. If this is all melting your brain, just remember this mantra. Perfect means 3 because of the Trinity, and imperfect means 2 because not the Trinity. I will be using these finger symbols on screen as shorthand. For example, in spondé, the L's are perfected so that they equal, in our anachronistic model from earlier, a dotted quarter note instead of a lone quarter note. Lastly, vertical lines are rests, and broadly speaking, the longer the line, the longer the rest, though the length of it can also be modified by the rhythmic mode. So looking at this following example, the 3 parts are written on top of one another, which is quite rare in period manuscripts. The notes are placed on staves of 5 lines, the same as today, and they are clumped together in groups of 2 or 3. Those are ligatures, and there are also these vertical lines I just mentioned, those are the rests. By looking at the way the notes are grouped, i.e. at the ligatures, we can determine the mode. Here's a table that shows us how to determine the mode by looking at these ligatures, courtesy of Apel. And if we compare the ligatures to his model, we see that there's a group of 3 moving to a group of 2, indicating trochaic mode, and it applies to both the triplum, or the top voice, as well as the duplum, or the middle voice. However, the ligatures get broken up whenever a note is repeated or when the syllable changes, so these exceptions must be accounted for if you want to find out what the mode is correctly. There's a fair amount more to modal notation than what we've gone over here, and we'll touch on it a little bit more next time, but these are the basic principles which will influence other systems that we look at going forward. And the video is getting long enough, so we will have to call it here. I will see you next time to talk about Franconian notation. As always, thanks for watching.